Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So we finally have a new speaker. And Tim, I got to tell you, the way the media is painting him, that it's like he's some crazy extremist. Media coverage, I gotta believe it seems to be getting worse and worse every year. I read a handful of articles about him, and most of them quote off the chart lefty progressives, painting him as some sort of Darth Vader. But when I saw him on Fox News, interview with Shannon Bream, Fox News Sunday, he seems like you're pretty much a run-of-the-mill GOP conservative politician. So if you ask me, I'm going to reserve judgment. I want to see what he can deliver. One test, of course, is how he's going to get the consensus to fund the government in a couple of weeks. So we'll see in the days ahead.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the left-wing groups have been going into overdrive. I think they call him MAGA Mike, and they definitely want to create a boogeyman out of him. But I think having that wait-and-see attitude is the way to go. You know, certainly his first full week last week as speaker was pretty successful. They passed one of the bills to fund the government, and they passed the emergency funding bill for Israel, though the complaint, and it was on a bipartisan vote, but the complaints on the left were, well, because it cut funding for the IRS. Well, I think most Americans, if you ask them, do we want to give full aid to Israel and will cut funding from the IRS to pay for it, I think most people would agree with that. And I think most people like the idea of, well, if we're going to increase spending in some area, well, we need to cut spending in other areas. We can't just print the money, even though the federal government can print money. So I think that's refreshing, really, to have, that. They certainly have a very ambitious strategy going forward. But now the question is going to be, well, okay, we're going to pass all the government funding bills. How are we going to do a temporary continuing resolution to fund the government while you're working on the budget? Is it going to be just keeping it at existing funding levels, or are you going to cut spending in the continuing resolution? If you do that, that might provoke a fight with the Democrats and a government shutdown. So that's the thing that's going to be interesting to see, is how does he navigate these many landmines? And can he cut a deal? Because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker has to cut a deal with Senator Schumer. And can he do that? And what does a deal like that look like on these key areas? And will the majority of House Republicans go along with that? So we will see. It remains to be seen, but give the man a chance. We just don't know yet how he's going to do at all of these things.
That's right. I mean, he's going to need a lot of skill to get all of those, everyone to buy in. But Tim, I wonder what you think. So we're pretty much, aren't we in the same situation as we were with Kevin McCarthy? I mean, but instead we went through this entire exercise over the past 3-4 weeks, booting the House booting Kevin McCarthy out, and yet we're still in the same situation.
Isn't it amazing how things like that happen? But that is exactly right. I mean, this basically is the situation we were in late September. We just lost about 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Yeah. So it certainly doesn't make it any easier to cut a deal. And okay, say Speaker Johnson is able to cut a deal with Schumer that is largely along the lines of a deal McCarthy would have cut with
That's
Senator
exactly
Schumer.
Right. That's exactly
Is
right.
it okay just because Speaker Johnson did it? You know, that there certainly would be a lot of hypocrisy around if that is the case, but we're going to see. But he faces big tests ahead, certainly on keeping the government open, Israel and Ukraine funding. And we just don't know where he's going to be or how he's going to negotiate or whether they will be able to make a deal, let alone there are a whole bunch of other external challenges where we don't know how he's going to be, namely campaign fundraising, where he's a very, I don't know that I would call him a poor fundraiser. Let's call him an inexperienced fundraiser. Well, now who's replacing the greatest Republican fundraiser in history in Kevin McCarthy. Now all of a sudden he has to raise a fortune and overnight to defend his House majority. So he's there's not a lot of hours for sleep in the Johnson household these days. There's a lot of work he's got to do and all at once.
Yeah. And then we've got to keep our eye on China and their moves on Taiwan. There's the border crisis that a lot of conservatives want the government to do something. So there are a lot of side issues that he's got to grapple with, and we wish him luck.
Yes, we would not want to be in his shoes.
Anyway, there's some new polls on the Senate race here in California. Tim, you've been following them. What's happening there?
So the latest poll just came out from the UC Berkeley IGS, and they find, as we found in the previous polls, a tight race. So you have Katie Porter is in the lead with 17%. Adam Schiff is in second place with 16%. So remember, we have a top two primary in California. So the top two vote getters, regardless of party, go to the general election. Then you have Steve Garvey, who recently entered the race as a Republican. He's at 10%, and Barbara Lee, the Oakland Congresswoman, is at 9%. And then whole bunch of everybody else is in single digits. So I think it's, the race really hasn't changed much, that you have Porter and Schiff have pretty much been neck and neck in first place at about, high teens to 20% in there since the race began. Now we're really going to start the campaign because remember, the election is on Super Tuesday in March. So the big money, Adam Schiff, I believe, had $32 million in the bank. So the big television advertising is going to start any day now. We're going to have the campaign begin in earnest. So the questions will be, can those two cement their front runner status and make it to the top two? Can Barbara Lee put up a fight and make it into second place? Then the other thing are the Republicans. There's still 34% of Californians are Republican voters. More Republicans will be voting on Super Tuesday in numbers because remember, the Republican presidential campaign will be going on, so there'll be more interest for Republicans voting. Can a Steve Garvey coalesce enough Republican votes to make it to the top two? If he is able to do that, he will make the top two. So we'll see, can he run a fully competitive campaign to make the top two? He starts out at a disadvantage with me, of course, as a Giants fan, but we'll see.
Well, I've been thinking about, this issue of Steve Garvey running, and obviously I'm of a certain age that back in the 80s and early 90s when Steve Garvey was playing baseball, and I thought, well, naturally everyone should know Steve Garvey. But, that was 20, 30 years ago when I was in my 20s. And that's when, I did a lot of baseball, when I followed baseball. But there are a lot of the X and Y or the Y and Z generation who don't know Steve Garvey. And that's going to be a challenge. And there are people who have probably passed who knew Steve Garvey from back in the day. So I'm wondering if, his name recognition is still out there. There's going to be swaths of Californians who don't know him. And then there are going to be Giants fans and who don't like him either. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
And they did go through, kind of the different parts of the state, and an outlier in Steve Garvey's support. If you look at the San Francisco Bay Area, he's at just 4%. His lowest showing in the state is in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I think there's something to Giants fans not wanting to support Mr. Dodger.
So I've got one announcement for an event, probably our last event of the year. Wanted to tell our listeners that we are having a luncheon starring our very own Lance Izumi. He's very popular on the podcast. We always have a lot of listeners when he's on. He's going to talk about a very important issue, affirmative action in higher education in the aftermath of the Harvard, North Carolina discrimination case against Asian Americans. And that has implications across the board because the Supreme Court wanted to, in their opinion, ended affirmative action in higher education. It's pretty clearly. So what's going to happen? What does that mean for a K-12 education? What does that mean for higher education? And he's also going to talk about his great book, The Great Parent Revolt, and what ordinary citizens are doing to put common sense back in schools and take back control of their kids' education. So Lance is a great speaker. He not only gives you the facts, but as a scholar, he gives you the facts as a scholar, but he's always gives a very impassioned, moving speech.
Oh, and he really is a crowd pleaser. I have been with him to many of his speeches, and I hear his stories when he comes back from the road giving these speeches, and you're going to be entertained. You're going to be informed. He'll make you think. It'll be a really good luncheon. So if you're interested in any of these issues, really any education topics in general, I highly recommend you get tickets to see him on November 30th. So this week on Next Round, we have a special conversation between Elizabeth Funk, who is the CEO of Dignity Moves, which is an organization helping the homeless in Santa Barbara and San Francisco and other communities. And they specialize in kind of taking temporarily available parking lots and other lots and building tiny home communities there. And Wayne and Elizabeth had a great tour a few weeks ago, and you can watch the full video tour at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. And you can see, them go around, and we talked to some of the residents as well. But they had a terrific conversation after their tour about Dignity Moves work and how do we help chronic homelessness in big cities like San Francisco. And so this is an extended version of their conversation. Now, I will say, we do our best audio capture wise, but they were in San Francisco outside. You'll hear horn honking and other background noise as you would expect in a city. But I think it's a really fascinating conversation with a truly dynamic leader on homelessness. I think you'll all enjoy hearing what she has to say.
Yeah, Tim, I loved it. I thought it was a fascinating discussion on what we can practically do for the homeless situation here. And they've got a really fantastic solution with these little houses that you can move, that don't cost much, and really going a long way for not a lot of money in helping people transition back to the community. So thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Elizabeth Funk.
The facility is fantastic, Elizabeth. I guess, starting broadly, and we can better go to your philosophy, because this is a huge break, and we've been talking about this, from the current approach that I think would be much more effective. I was hoping you could speak to that and try to educate people about what's happening here and why it's so important.
Yes, well, I think people are really frustrated with homelessness, and part of the reason is they don't understand why it's like this. And so we started this group with a group of members from Young Presidents Organization, YPO, who are all CEOs and presidents, very private sector thinking. And we didn't intend to start a nonprofit. We were really coming together as a working group to analyze and understand, because it is a head scratcher. We keep spending more and more money, and the problem keeps getting worse. How is that possible, right? So we started to look into it, and when you look at it from an analytical perspective, where you let go of all the idealism and all of the everything and just fresh look, the system looks like this. When somebody becomes homeless, they can get a bunk bed in a group shelter, and there are not even enough of those, and there's no other alternative until they can get placed on permanent housing of some sort. The cities have enormous budgets that are growing, but they're spending them all on permanent supportive housing, for them mostly all. And the problem with that permanent supportive housing is that it is costing $650,000 per unit on average in California. And in big cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles, it can be over $1 million per unit, right? And it takes 5 years, maybe 7 years to get permitted. That's if you're not getting neighborhood opposition. So the system looks like this. For every one person who finally gets that permanent supportive housing, 4 are falling into homelessness. Think about you're going into a pipe, and 1 goes out and 4 go in, and there aren't any outlets to the pipe other than that. Of course, it's going to break, right? It's just simple physics. And so today, cities are saying that permanent housing is getting more and more expensive, so we got to try harder. Taking a fresh look and going, wait a minute, you can try to get those costs from 650 to 350. You're still having the wrong ratios. So looking at it simplistically, the first thing you do is stop the inflow. And experts say, and I agree, that the best use of dollars in the homeless system is prevention. Those are the most bang for your buck. But when somebody becomes homeless, when they first become homeless, less than 20% on that day have a debilitating enough mental or behavioral health problem that would prevent them from returning to self-sufficiency. They were self-sufficient yesterday. They have certainly gone through trauma. They definitely need to regroup. They need to take a deep breath. In fact, my dad said I should name this organization A Deep Breath because it's what it is, right? But now let's not start with the assumption that they are destined for welfare housing for the rest of their lives. This is a stop valve with lots of exits. You come in and you take your deep breath and you start thinking about other exits. And at that moment, if we can get you indoors early enough, before you've had too many cold nights and you say yes to the drug dealer, if we can get you indoors, plug in your cell phone, a shower, let's do everything we can with the full expectation that you're going to return to self-sufficiency or other avenues of stability. Certainly, some of them can't. Schizophrenia runs in the poor and the homeless just like it does with the wealthy. That's what society is for. There will be some who aren't going to be able to take care of themselves. That's fine. We've identified that, and we can start dealing with it for what it is in this, it's a sorting mechanism, right? And so if you think about that, the problem is that when people go from the streets into shelter or this housing, they're still homeless, right? They're sheltered homeless. And correctly, our governments have decided that the only exit out of homelessness is permanent housing. They're right, it is. When you are in permanent housing, you are no longer homeless. But if you don't have an alternative in the meantime, then the longer you stay on those streets, you're more and more certain to be in permanent housing. So we believe from a systems level, investing in this stop valve makes a lot of sense. However, this is a new thing. It didn't exist. Looking back, we had permanent housing, huge, shelter, little, nothing in between. So we're really creating a whole new category of housing. And because people have their own room, the door that locks, that's why they're willing to come. So far nobody's turned this down, I'm told, so you get them in. So at a systems level, it makes a lot of sense. It also is very obvious that governments don't turn on a dime. And this hasn't been in their budgets. It hasn't been in their strategic plans. And so the private sector has said, okay, well, let us do it anyway.
To me, what's also, and we've been talking about this all day, which is the private sector. Yes. The ability to turn on a dime, the ability to be responsive, we were talking earlier about the idea that the government homeless infrastructure, one, it's understaffed, and two, they have their metrics.
Right.
And they're bound by their metrics. You, as a private organization,
we're not. Right.
So you can innovate.
Think at that level. So, one thing that I want to talk about is what the supervisors in San Francisco called a place for all. So, in fact, they announced it on the front steps of 33 Goff not long after we opened. And Supervisor Mandelman posed the question and unanimously approved by the supervisors as a whole, that ordered the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing to assess what it would take to have shelter for all in San Francisco. And ask them to do it, just said, report back on what it would look like to have a place for everybody who's on our streets today. So the Department of Homelessness dutifully responded and wrote their report. It was issued in December that essentially said, I'm sorry, we won't answer the question because it's not possible. And Supervisor Mandelman had his hearing in the spring, and he, in a loud voice, drove home the point that said, I didn't ask you if it was possible. I asked you what it would take. And watching that and thinking about it, I look at it and I say, they're right. It isn't possible with their budget and with their constraints, right? And their goals and their metrics and their department is set up to end homelessness, which is permanent housing. That's what they're set up for. It isn't possible for them to do this, but nor should they. And we as the private sector have it in our heads that government is responsible for homelessness, and our job is to sit here and complain that they don't do it well enough, right? We all have a stake in this. And so what we started thinking is, they're right, it isn't possible for them to do it. But just because they're the Department of Homelessness, why should they have to do it alone? And so if we look at it from the private sector's perspective, they may not have the budget to get everybody indoors, but collectively as a community, we have devastating enough losses happening in our corporate bottom lines, everything else. There's plenty of money out there to end unsheltered homelessness, but we just don't think it's our responsibility. So Dignity Moves coming in as a private sector-led organization is saying, yeah, it is. Let's think about it. What would it take? And so after the Department of Homelessness issued their report, and they didn't really say it wasn't possible, they just quoted some very large numbers that were way larger than their budget. So we started thinking, well, let's answer that question ourselves. What would it take? And it's actually quite simple. You look at how many people are unsheltered as of the last point in time count, 4,700. You need 60% is the number of units and beds you need to build. And I can go into that in a minute about how that 60% comes up. So that's about 2,500 beds that you need. Ironically, that's actually the same number that HSH cited is how many they would need. So they checked my math, 2,500. Then you look at a map of the city of San Francisco and you put on polka dots of all the vacant land that's out there. Really important that it's polka dots, that it is distributed across the city, because what we have found is that one little initiative here or one little initiative there gets so much complaint and resistance that it can never get off the ground. But if you look at it holistically and say, okay, we need 30 vacant parking lots to do 2,500 beds. Then you look at how much permanent supportive housing is coming online in the next few years. And I say permanent supportive because for the current batch of people on the streets, a lot of them have been on the streets a long time and they are going to need permanent supportive housing. In the future, the ratio will be lower. But you look at how much permanent supportive housing is coming online, and there are a few thousand units coming in the next few years. So 2,500 a day. 2 years from now, you might need 2,000 units. And a few years later, you might need fewer and fewer. As you work through that inventory, the interim housing we're going to need is going to be smaller and smaller amounts. And so if that site up there on Nob Hill, the developer is going to be breaking ground in 2 years. That's one of the ones that'll just be 2 years. This guy is waiting for high-speed rail to come. That one might be here a little bit longer, right? And so you can map it out and spread this around the city. And if you build cabins like this, the total is about $170 million to build and construct enough private, dignified housing for everyone on the streets in San Francisco today. $170 million. Currently, the city's spending about $600 million per year. But that's because that permanent housing is expensive, and they should, right? And so that's very, very doable. It's doable by the private sector because the private sector can move fast. Every day that goes by, that person's on the street is debilitating. It has to be done fast and urgently, but it's very, very much can be done. And if you tally up all of the companies that are losing money like crazy, if Shorenstein's losing $10 million a year because people don't rent their office space anymore, they should be in for $9,999 to solve it. And if you add up all of the businesses and housing values that have gone down and all those things, I can find $170 million by this afternoon, right?
So basically, what we're talking about is you take $170 million. Let's say we're gonna solve this. You take $170 million. You're gonna find 40 empty lots across the city. On those empty lots, just like where we're sitting, you can build these movable homes. Now, there's them all, they're dorm room size, but they're private. They meet all the needs that we talked about, and they're movable. We can put out and get everybody off the streets.
Yep.
Those, and what you're basically saying is those who are not going to be able to get to be sustainable because people have been living on the streets for so long, we have to acknowledge it's going to take longer. For some, it may be not possible,
yep.
But they've been dealing with a lot more hardships.
Yes.
As they start to move along, we now have the ability to prevent more people from falling into the trap that they had to deal with.
Yes.
So now we're in ability not only to get people off the streets, but to prevent.
Yes. You may not be preventing them falling into homelessness. What you're preventing is them becoming chronically homeless. Chronic homelessness is defined as having a debilitating mental or behavioral health issue and having been on the streets for a long time. I can't prevent a domestic violence survivor from leaving her husband and ending up on the street. I can prevent that becoming a chronic condition. And so and I want to be very clear, $170 million is to build them. The expensive part is the supportive services. But today, those supportive services are happening 14 years after you became homeless in supportive services. And that, if you take that money and you shift it to the beginning, it's a much higher probability of efficacy, right? Where you're going to have other outcomes other than just being watched. But the thing is, so And when we talk about these tiny cabins being in 30 sites around the city, this is not specifically what they will all be. We start by saying, what other projects are out there trying to get going, right? So if we need 2,500 rooms, Salvation Army is trying to get 1,000 rooms built. They own the land, they've got their drawings, can't get the funding for it. The domestic violence survivors group that's in the south of Market, they're trying desperately to get funding to build more beds, but they can't. The reason they can't is because people have become so fatalistic about this problem. They've just decided there's no solution. So why would I throw money at one project that's going to chip away at the problem when one person gets out and 4 people come in, right? And so they're all having trouble getting donors to be involved, and understandably. The only thing that's missing is if I could convince people that when you add them all up together, it solves the problem, solves it, gets everyone indoors, not just 30 people. Now all of a sudden, all these things get funded, right? And so the first thing we do is we figure out who else has got initiatives going, and some of them may be a high-rise building, some of them maybe, doesn't matter. These cabins can fill in the gaps where there aren't enough. This is only one solution. You're going to have some folks formerly incarcerated who don't want walls yet. That's fine. One of the sites can be safe sleeping with tents. They get over that fast generally, but the first 6 months, people coming out of prison, I respect that, right? So there can be all sorts of different flavors. And the ones that are only going to be needed for 2 years, you use pallet, which is, very fast and not intended to be a long-term solution, but for a year or two, great. We're also ultimately going to always need some interim housing, so that should be the hotels and be permanent, right? So there's kind of a whole range. But the thing that I've started to understand in the not in my backyard pushback from neighbors comes from 2 things. First of all, the city announcing, we're going to build something on Mission Street. Of course, the neighbors are like, what? Why me, right? And so the vision for this is that you take the 38 neighborhood districts in San Francisco, say Pacific Heights, and you empower them to solve their problem the way they want to. And when I say empower them, we have to think very, very specifically within the framework of Martin versus Boise. And to be able to make it illegal to sleep on the streets.
Okay, Martin versus Boise is the lawsuit that says that if there's not an available bed, you can't enforce no camping laws.
It's very logical. The Supreme Court has said you should not be able to arrest somebody for doing something they can't avoid. That is basic, fundamental, cruel and unusual punishment. And so it was upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that some homeless advocates sued the city of Boise and said you should not be allowed to arrest them for sleeping on the streets if they don't have an alternative. So that is applicable to the states that are within, California being one of them, within the Ninth Circuit. And so the problem is, so San Francisco will go out to an encampment and say you can't camp here. They can't arrest them for it, but they'll move them down the street. Sweep them down the street. Okay, whatever that cost was wasted money, right? So what I want to do is turn that concept from a stick, can't do it, into a carrot that says you can enforce that your neighborhood is a no camping ordinance because you did offer everyone a bed. And by the way, a dignified one, right? And so the idea would be neighborhood by neighborhood to go to Pacific Heights and say you've got 100 people sleeping on your streets. The math says and the law says, therefore you need to build 60 rooms. I can help you get some ideas, like that Catholic church over there is a really big parking lot and I've never seen more than 5 cars in it. But you guys do it where you want to. If you come together, and there are ways we're going to help, and build those 60 beds, you make valid offers of shelter to everyone who's there. It is going to be posted and it is going to be enforced. No sleeping on the streets in Pacific Heights. You are well within your rights to do that. And I can assure you the cities and everybody would love to enforce those camping laws. But they can't do it, and they shouldn't do it, unless they've got a valid place to offer somebody. So if you empower the neighborhood associations, they can decide what color and the archway, they can decide who's the general contractor, they can decide a whole lot of stuff. They have to have made a valid offer to 60 people. So that's the way we intend to set this up. And there's a lot more we can do for those neighborhood associations than just that. First, obviously, we can start with suggestions of vacant land. We will do a lot of that. But we can also help with funding in some very interesting ways, which is that today, let's take Blue Shield Foundation. They want to fund programs for domestic violence survivors. Here at 33 Goff, we might have 2 or 3 out of 95. So they're not going to fund this. What if we created a site dedicated for domestic violence survivors? Now all of a sudden, I've unlocked money that wasn't there before. The Veterans Association has a lot of money to go toward housing veterans, as they should. They should have a veterans site, or at least veterans designated beds. What about LGBTQ? There's a lot of money to make sure that those folks were unfortunately very disproportionately represented in homelessness. So if you start to segment, and then job seekers, LinkedIn should have resume writers at the job seekers site, and it should be next to the people who are chronically addicted to meth, right? So if you segment it out, and then the other one becomes the Salvation Army. Those beds are conditional on sobriety. Housing First says that you cannot make housing a condition, sobriety a condition for housing. Well, if we had 3 or 4 options, that could count towards this solution because somebody could opt into the sober bed. And I think there are a lot of folks who would like to opt in, but the government can't fund Salvation Army because it's conditional. That's only because that's the only offer that the person has. So when you can do it and divide up by segments, the specialized services can be more effective. You can decide that it's not just the next person on the waiting list that gets this bed. They can wait and go to the sober one, and somebody goes to domestic violence one. Now all of a sudden at a systems level, things change when you do it systems-wide. Funding comes because it's optimistic, that shows we can do this and we are doing this. The specialized services mean that we don't have to just take the next person in line. All sorts of things fall into place if it just gets tied up under one umbrella. And this is not Diggy Moves building 2,500 rooms. I think there are probably at least half of those out there in some stage of aspiration and planning that they just can't get funded. So if we tie it all together, then all of a sudden there's courage.
And you're creating something that is, from a funding perspective, it is more cost effective, right? You're talking about 170 million. And I know there's supports of 170 million versus 3 times that amount. And we look at it on a per unit basis, $20,000, $30,000, not $600,000.
Exactly.
So you're talking about a huge difference. The other thing I think was really important, and you were talking about the multiple pathways out. And I think what's intriguing is if you have that sobriety, now all of a sudden people who are ready to Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever the program is, they're together, they're a support system. They've created that community.
Yes.
And so with the job seekers, we've talked about the importance of community. You're now segmenting into communities that can self-reinforce.
Yes. And, the thing about community is interesting is that people don't want to go to a group shelter. They will come here because they have privacy. They can take a deep breath, close their door, get into a mental space where they feel stable. And yet, people on the encampments have learned that community is literally survival. And community is also a really healing peer pressure kind of a thing, right? I mean, in college, I didn't have my own bathroom in my dorm. And I had to go down the hall to go to the bathroom, and that's a good thing. I had to eat at the dining room. I couldn't lock myself away. That was by definition, that was important. And here, if you can get a community who are all dealing with the same types of things, the services can be specialized, but that peer support is something that gets missing when you're in a general population room. And I've got people here who aren't working. They used to work or they are currently working, and they're complaining that somebody's shooting up next door. Well, they are, right? It's not a healthy spot for you, but this is the only generic vanilla bed available. But they don't have to be next to somebody who's shooting up, right? And the cost benefit, there's a big piece people didn't understand when you look at the cost benefit, is that when somebody's on our streets, they're costing us more per year than it would cost us to give them proper supportive services indoors. The average is $50,000 to $60,000, maybe $75,000 per person per year that unsheltered homelessness is costing society. People don't understand that because it comes from lots of different budgets. It's the Department of Public Works cleaning up feces and needles. It's the emergency room seeing that person a whole lot more than they should. It's probation, it's law enforcement, all those things added up. Different estimates. The last one was written 10 years ago, so inflation has kicked in. That one said $63,000 per person per year. I'll bet it's $90,000 per person per year. To be here, even with intensive supportive services, the programs we're talking about is less than $40,000 per year. The cost benefit to society is very obvious, especially if there's at least some probability that once they're in interim housing, they exit to self-sufficiency rather than getting a $1 million apartment that's still $40,000 a year in supportive services.
Well, but that's still also the permanent housing hasn't shown itself capable of really helping people transition. Right?
It's not intended to.
Right.
Permanent supportive housing is not intended for you to transition somewhere else. It is a place to keep you safe until you die. It's giving up on you. Right. I hate to say that. Giving up is the wrong word. But it is the end of the line in terms of your journey through the system. The city has tried to start a program that is a step-up housing or something that's encouraging people to get from there out into scattered sites. But that's new, and that's not really part of the system. And scattered sites being important. But here's the problem that we've dealt with more and more as we're seeing it, which is, let's say in a city we find a piece of land that's got enough rooms for 100 people. And we have philanthropy that says, we'll build 100 rooms. I'm sorry to say, you still have a city say, no, thank you, we'll only take 30. What? You're going to leave 70 still on the street? Yes, because when they're on the street, it's not coming out of my budget. When I get them indoors, I'm now responsible for 3 meals a day and to keep them safe and security. I only want them indoors if I've got a clear line of sight for where they're going next. If I've got 30 apartments coming online, I'll take 30 now because I know I'm not going to be responsible for caring for them indefinitely. They wouldn't say it this way, but that translates to I'd rather 70 be on the streets than be indoors because it's costing the hospital and probation and everybody else, not my apartment. I'm so not okay with that, and I don't think anyone is if they think about it that way. But if we push hard enough and say, I don't care, we'll build them anyway, we're getting everybody indoors, now what? Where are they going to go? They're going to have to be here a little longer. This is supply and demand, and the housing supply isn't there yet, and we got to say, I don't care, we're getting them indoors anyway. So we've got to let go of the success metric, which is how fast do we get somebody out, because that's not the right success metric.
The other thing you have to do, and this begins that process, is change the incentives of the government.
Yes.
The government is ineffective not because people don't care, but because the incentives of a bureaucracy are not meant to be flexible, right?
Right.
The military, right? That you have a structured order, that's the right way for that to operate, but it's not flexible. Different problems, different solutions. What you're doing is you're changing those incentives. You're saying, you know what? This money's coming out. And I'm going to save the government money, but to the extent that you get the county supervisor at the top level, he's responsible for the whole budget.
So, the thing is that the government has rules that are very rigid for very good reasons.
Right.
You've got a budget allocation. It can only be spent on this, and it should only be spent on this. And if you do it wrong, you've got problems. So it is designed to not be innovative. Right. We don't want it to be innovative, right? And so when a bureaucrat or somebody in the department does something innovative, if it succeeds, they get a pat on the back. If it fails, they get fired. Why would they be innovative, right? And we pass a budget and it says this money is meant for this. They shouldn't be taking it and doing something else, right? And so we want them to stay in their lane and let's divide those lanes right. But when something new comes along that needs to be done, we're not going to twist their arm to do it. We need to rise up. This is not government versus private sector. And
this is where the private sector can excel.
Yes. We have the most to lose from people sleeping in front of my restaurant. We, private sector. Let's pool together ourselves, get everybody indoors, and then let the government catch up with the permanent housing, which is what they do best. And it needs government to build that permanent housing. $800,000, you're not going to have philanthropy do that. Right?
Well, but it seems to me that you won't need nearly as much permanent housing because you're going to be able to transfer, especially in the future, you're transferring people, getting them sustainable, getting somebody back into kind of where they want to be, a much more humane outcome where I have a family, I have a home, I have a job, I'm working towards my goals of fulfilling life. That's, from a human perspective, that's what we want to achieve.
Yes.
And you're better positioned to do that. Permanent housing isn't.
They're still going to need permanent housing. They're going to need permanent affordable housing rather than supportive housing.
And that's regulations of building. That's, huge or much supply and demand. Why housing's unaffordable because you can't build, and when you do build, we inflate the cost.
Yes.
We can address that. That's a very different problem.
Somebody else needs to do that, and I want to be clear. Getting people into interim housing does not solve homelessness. It is one piece of a much more complex problem, including housing costs. And people much smarter than me need to do that, and racial equity issues and drug crises. All those things are part of this jigsaw puzzle. Getting people indoors and off of the streets is only one component. I believe that you pick, each person and each team picks one component. We can't do it all. All Home is a really great analysis group, the experts on these things, has written a really excellent report that calls for a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 for homelessness resources. 1 unit of interim for 2 units of permanent for 4 of prevention. Dignity Moves and this Dignity Now initiative is addressing the 1. Does not mean 2 and 4 are any less important. Those are for somebody else to do. But addressing interim housing and unsheltered, it is the most inhumane, the most visible, and ironically, the one that is the easiest to solve. This is just putting roofs over people's heads, then everybody else can do their part, right? And I really think that unsheltered, even though it's only one component, and a lot of people think unsheltered homelessness is synonymous with homeless. They don't realize the complexity of that. But I believe that if 1 person exits and 4 come in, at some point we're going to hit an existential moment. They talk in climate change about when temperatures rise above 2%, that the feedback mechanisms get out of control, and it literally is not solvable. At some point, unsheltered homelessness grows to the point where the tax base leaves, companies leave, tourism leaves. There may be a point where it truly is no longer solvable, right? The resources to do it have left, and the problem has gotten insurmountable. So I believe the private sector, there is so much energy out there to solve this. They're ready to, and we've got to do it now. The good news is the Martin versus Boise and the courts have set the prime. Today, most recently in the last couple of weeks, it is now okay again to enforce anti-camping laws, provided that you have made valid offers and so forth. The emergency building codes are still in effect that allow us to do these really quickly. All of the pieces necessary to get this done and to end unsheltered homelessness in the city are aligned. And the most important is that the level of energy and anger has hit a boiling point. There's so much electricity in this air that is frustrated about homelessness, and it can go one of 2 places. It can go leave the town, which a lot of people are doing. It can create a lot of anger and frustration. If we could direct it with a lightning rod and point it towards a solution, man, there's a lot of energy out there to do it. But people don't want to do it if they don't believe it'll actually make a difference and solve the problem. If we can show that it does, I think it's a game changer.
I do too. It's fantastic. I think we're just overwhelmed by just the wonderful. I mean, you're doing the Lord's work here, and it's the place is fantastic. I guess as a last question, and I guess we kind of talked about kind of where you're going with this, but where do you see things 3-4 years from now? Like, what is your optimistic scenario?
Well, here's the vision: is that we Dignity Moves are just going to map the last mile, so to speak. All this analysis has come in. We know what needs to be done. We will, quite frankly, shoot a big dose of optimism into the system that says if everybody does their part very credibly, it does solve it. Credibility is McKinsey, right? I don't care that credibility, but somebody who can show that it will happen. So what we're going to do is pull together all of the forces, the neighborhood associations, McKinsey, the United Way, Bay Area Council, all these credible forces say, yep, this does work, and I will do my part. And we map it out, we figure who else is doing what, and reinstill optimism. At that point, we can generally step back and watch the system happen. And a place for all legislation, the gauntlet was 3 years. What would it take to end it in 3 years? So that's what we're going to set, is 3 years. We're going to give the instruction book, going to let everybody do their thing. This is not us doing it. It's empowering everybody else to do what they're going to do. And my goal is 3 years from now, the community will have a no sleeping zone within the city limits of San Francisco, California. What does that do with Oakland? What does that do with what? And wouldn't that just cause a worse problem, because everybody in the United States is going to come to San Francisco to get one of these beautiful cabins or one of these solutions? The answer there is that if you were not offered one of these beds in the moment, or you did not have a validated nexus to San Francisco, then you're still going to get an offer of housing, but it's going to be a navigation center. It's going to be a bunk bed. So we've still fulfilled our obligations under Martin versus Boise, but it is not an attractive enough magnet to get people to come. So that's how we prevent the magnet. The real way we prevent the magnet is we write up this idea as a template, and you hand it to Oakland, you hand it to... So Los Angeles is already saying, where's mine? I want mine. And San Jose is saying, we want ours, we want ours. So what we'll do is set this all up with San Francisco, and we'll go map it for San Jose. It's do it yourself, open source. Anybody can take this concept. We'll refine it over time. But my job is go do it in the next city and the next city, and let's, neighborhood by neighborhood, let's end this problem.
Well, exactly what you were saying. You can't just do it one neighborhood in San Francisco, all of San Francisco. Well, in a way, you can't just do it in San Francisco.
Yep.
It's a statewide problem, and then even go further from that.
It's such a simple aha that it's kind of crazy. It's like, this problem is very, very solvable. We just have to do it together. It's not solvable with the Department of Homelessness. It's not solvable with the, Community Forward or anybody. They can't solve it alone. The simplest aha is, let me show you how to get everybody on the same team on one team report.
I can't thank you for welcoming us in, showing us your wonderful facility, and taking the time for this. So thank you very much.
Well, it's exciting, and I really hope that, I shouldn't even say I hope that all the stakeholders will agree to be a part of this. They're all dying to be a part of this. And all the government needs to do is stand back, agree to a few basic things like continue to expedite permits and all that kind of stuff, and then redirect their energy to the stuff that really solves this problem. And together we can do it.
And then learn the lesson that leaning on the private sector is a way to solve problems.
Yes, and let the private sector know that they not only can solve this, they need to.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.